Can I introduce Jaideep, Professor of Marketing here, Head of the Marketing Division. I think one of the things that we now need to change the emphasis a bit. We've talked about what in a sense are developed economies at the moment with Duncan, and he made the point there are a lot of people who are actually not in this position, even connected to the internet. And this way that we're now talking about, the frugal innovation, the new markets and the new ways to market in the developing countries, is something which is spilling over and adds to some of the things that Phil was talking about, how entrepreneurs start. So Jaideep, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. So thanks, Richard, and thanks, Duncan. I think I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that both Richard and Duncan and the questions have touched on. I'm going to talk about frugal innovation, new markets and new routes to market. So I've spent my career studying innovation. And in the first part of my career, I studied innovation in large Western companies or advanced economy companies, because the understanding was that's where innovation happens. And then in about 2007 or so, I turned my attention to emerging markets like India, where I'd grown up. And when I went to India and talked to innovators there, I was struck by how their approach seemed very different from their Western counterparts. And they seemed different in three ways. First, their approach was very frugal. They seemed very good at doing more with less. Secondly, their approach was very flexible. They were not particularly structured in their approach, and there was a lot of lateral thinking and improvisation. And finally, a lot of their solutions seemed designed to bring people who are outside the formal economy into the formal economy. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. So by way of contrast, this is a bit of a caricature, but it helps me make my point. In an affluent society, this is something we might regard as an innovation. So this is a high-end fridge that will talk to you and you can talk back to via this tablet PC. And for that pleasure, you pay about $3,000. Now, it's a bit of a caricature, but it makes my point. Often large companies have structured approaches to innovation. They have big teams, big budgets. The engineers are focused on pushing the technology frontier, sometimes for the sake of doing so. In the end, they'll come up with some technology that they put into their products to differentiate them. And because this is expensive, they'll charge the customer for it. Now, you may see something like that in a country like India, but you're equally likely to see something like this. So that's about $3,000. That's about $30. It's a clay fridge. It uses the cooling properties of water in this reservoir, not only to keep that water cool, but also to keep fruit and vegetables fresh as the water evaporates through the walls. Now, this is frugal. It just uses clay and water. I'll tell you a bit about the entrepreneur in a second. A lot of improvisation and lateral thinking. And his intention is inclusivity. He comes from a village in India, and he wants to develop fridges for people like himself, people who'd like to own a fridge but often cannot afford one, or even if they could afford one, may not have access to electricity. Okay, here's another example. This is an incubator. It's a beautiful machine. It has all the bells and whistles from a company like GE, but it's about $25,000. And at that price, it's beyond the reach of most people in countries like India, particularly those in rural areas where the clinics will not be able to afford these machines. Even if somebody gave them the machines, they won't have a technician, and they often may not have access to regular access to electricity. In a situation like that, something like this is very powerful. This is very powerful. So this is about $25,000. This is less than $100. Now, it's not an incubator. It doesn't have an oxygen tent, for instance. It's a baby warmer. But it's designed to address a large part of the problem that this is addressing. The one problem of infant mortality, where if an infant is born 1 or 2 weeks prematurely, they cannot maintain their own body temperature. In some cases, they die. In other cases, they're very badly affected for the rest of their lives. This will save them. Interestingly, this wasn't developed by a large corporation. It was developed by 4 students at Stanford who took a course called Design for Extreme Affordability, where the entire objective of the course was to come up with a working prototype that's 1/100 the cost of the existing solution. And they could take any problem. These students took this problem of infant mortality. They came up with this. And after they graduated, they went on to form a company to commercialize this. They first tested it with customers, with mothers and midwives in rural Nepal and then in rural South India. They got venture capital backing from Stanford. They tested it in the medical hospital. And then when they were ready to commercialize, they hit a wall. They didn't have a sales force that could take this product to rural clinics, convince governments to adopt it, and so forth. And interestingly, at that point, they formed a non-exclusive licensing agreement with GE, and GE's sales force helped them to commercialize this. So I ended up, my co-authors and I ended up talking to scores of such innovators. And when we asked them how they would describe this approach, they often use this Hindi word jugaad in India. So we wrote a book about this with that word in the title, and we defined this approach as the art of overcoming harsh constraints by improvising an effective solution, not a perfect solution, but a good enough solution, and importantly, one that uses the resources that are available in that context. And after we published the book, lots of people from other parts of the world wrote to say that they had similar sort of ideas in their economies. So for instance, the Brazilians told us they had 2 words to describe something similar. And you see this not only in emerging markets, but you also see this in the West. And I'll touch on frugal innovation in the West in a bit. What we did in the book was to look at lots of examples and then try and see if there were some principles that were guiding these innovators. And these are the 6 principles we identified. These innovators are very good at exploiting adversity to spur their creativity. Necessity really is the mother of invention for them. They're very good at doing more with less. They use the resources that they do have to substitute for resources they don't. A lot of lateral thinking. The idea is that if you can't climb the mountain, find a way around it. The solutions are often simple. This helps to economize resources, but also helps with the adoption and use of solutions. They often include marginal consumers, not only as consumers, but also as part of the solution. And I'll give you examples in a minute. And finally, these people are very passionate about what they're doing, and they have to be because what they're doing is quite difficult and requires persistence over a period of time. So let me talk about some of them. This is Mansukh Bhai. He's the person behind the clay fridge. He comes from a village in the Indian state of Gujarat. He has a high school education. He comes from a family of potters. In 2001, there was a very serious earthquake in Gujarat. A lot of people lost their lives, their possessions. Many people lost the clay pots in which they traditionally store water. And he said that one morning he opened the local newspaper, which had a picture of someone's clay pot that was broken. And the caption read, "Poor man's fridge broken." It was a joke, but that gave him the inspiration to come up with one. And so he designed this fridge. He set up a factory in his village. He trained local women to make these fridges, and then he went on to sell them, including on the internet. And he embodies all those 6 principles in a way, getting ideas from adversity, keeping the solution simple, lot of lateral thinking. He uses resources that are available. Importantly, he includes marginal people not only as consumers, but also part of the solution. So the local women who are trained to make these fridges get an additional income, and sometimes they can use that to buy fridges. This is a bit like Henry Ford when he paid his workers enough that they could afford to buy a Model T. And of course, very passionate. You can see him talking about his various inventions on the internet. Here's a different sort of innovator we looked at. This is Dr. Mohan. He's a diabetes specialist in the South Indian city of Chennai. Diabetes is a very serious problem in places like India. But in cities, people can go to clinics like his to be treated, and they can pay for the treatment. So he has a very successful private practice in the city. But he's aware that in the villages near Chennai, there are people who don't know what diabetes is. They don't know if they have it. Even if they have it, they don't know what they're going to do about it. They will not go to the city. It's too far away, a bit intimidating, costly. His doctors in the city are not likely to go to the village because their families are in the city. So he's come up with this solution. He worked with the World Diabetes Foundation. They gave him this van. They gave him the equipment in the van. He worked with the Indian Space Research Organization who gave him the satellite dish. This van goes from village to village. People like this person from the village will step into the van. She looks through the eyepiece. The image is broadcast via satellite to the doctor, who can see it instantaneously on his computer screen and make a diagnosis that he then communicates to this person, who's a local health volunteer. So he's identified people like this from villages, trains them in the city for a few days, and then they go back to perform this important piece of work. So they know when the van is coming, they bring people in, and then they follow up. So you see lots of experiments and pilots such as this. In healthcare, you see lots of other examples. So this is Devi Shetty, cardiac surgeon, trained in Guy's Hospital in London, went back to India and was very, in a sense, disheartened to find that a lot of people couldn't even afford cardiac surgery. So he focused a lot on reducing the cost of cardiac surgery without compromising on the quality. And he applied many of the principles that, again, people like Henry Ford applied to building cars in cardiac surgery. So for instance, he identified all the steps that go into cardiac surgery. He identified those that only the doctor can perform, and the doctor only performs those. Other steps are performed by paramedics, the patient, or the patient's family. Then they focused on economies of scale. So he has a very big hospital in Bangalore in South India, 1,000-bed hospital. They do something like 30 major operations a day. And in this way, they get better at doing things, and they do things faster, better, cheaper. Cost management, just-in-time information, which they get on their mobile phones and so forth, on what were the costs and what were the revenues on the previous day. And in this way, they brought the cost of surgery down to something like $1,500, and they aim to bring it down even further. And they've taken this model to many other cities, not just in India, but elsewhere. A different sector. This is the example of Solar Electric Lighting Company, or Selco. And this is the founder, Harish Hande, in Bangalore, in South India. So he set up this company to sell solar lighting solutions to people outside the electricity grid who typically use kerosene. And the first problem he faced was the problem of affordability. A lot of the people he was trying to reach were not in the formal economy. They didn't have bank accounts. They couldn't easily take loans to buy the panels and the batteries. And he says that the best lesson in life he learned was from a fruit cart vendor who said to him that 300 rupees a month was too much, but 10 rupees a day was not. And a lot of the people he was reaching were like that in the informal economy. So the fruit cart vendor would wake up in the morning, she'd take a loan from the money lender. With that, she would buy fruit and vegetables, which she would sell during the day. With the money she made, she'd repay the money lender in the evening with the interest, buy food for her family, and then if she had money left over, she might buy kerosene for 10 rupees a pop. So he worked backwards from that insight, talking about customer insight. He worked backwards from that insight to say, how can I now offer solar lighting at 10 rupees a pop to people like that? And here is his solution. So again, he identifies people from the local community to be part of the solution, people like this gentleman here. He may have a high school education and typically not in the banking system. So Harish had to work with a bank to give people like that loans, which he guarantees for the first 6 months. With the loan, this person sets up shop, buys the panels and the batteries and the lights, charges the batteries during the day, and in the evening rents them to people like that fruit cart vendor for 10 rupees a pop. So she's better off because she gets a much better quality of light. It lasts longer, it doesn't create fires or give off fumes. If she has a business at home, she can improve her productivity, her kids can read late into the evening, and so she's better off. But so too is this guy, because after 6 months, he has a credit history, he's in the banking system, and he has a business. So you see lots of these very creative solutions, but the criticism often is that they stay very local and they don't scale. So that's where large companies enter the picture because they have the resources to do that. The Tata Group, for instance, Tata Motors developed this car, the nano car. That was the brainchild of Ratan Tata, who was CEO then. And his idea was, he'd be driven to work every day in Bombay and look out of this window and see scores of people on two-wheelers, often 2 adults, 2 or more children, very precariously balanced in bad traffic and bad weather. He thought, what if we could give them a car that was affordable? You'd have a large number of people who would move into the automotive sector. And so somebody in a press conference asked him, so what price would the car have to sell at? And he said, 100,000 rupees. And they worked backwards from that. That's about $2,000. His team worked backwards from that to come up with a car that would sell at that price. And it was a technical success. There were some issues with sales we can get into later. They've gone into other such frugal products. This is the water filter that they developed for $10, which uses some rice husk technology, nanotechnology. And that too has had challenges we can talk about later. Multinationals now, such as, for instance, GE. We talked about GE earlier. GE has its largest R&D center outside the US in Bangalore in South India. And they've been developing a whole range of medical devices specifically for particularly rural markets in countries like India. Now, one of the things they realized was that the rural clinics cannot afford big ECG machines that GE typically builds for Western hospitals or the city hospitals in the emerging world. Typically, doctors will go from the city to the countryside on a day trip. So the doctor would have to carry a device that would fit into a bag. So the ECG machine couldn't be like that. It would have to be like that. It would have to be very affordable, robust. It would have to run on batteries and so forth. So they knew it would have to look something like that. Then they went one step further and said, let's not do it the way we typically do things. In-house, big budget, big team, control all the IP and so forth. Let's do what our Chinese and Indian competitors do. Let's work backwards from the specification, and let's use off-the-shelf components. So for instance, we know we need some kind of a printer. What about using bus ticket printers? We can use that component. We can even use the paper. It'll be cheaper. We need some kind of a keypad. Telephones have keypads. We can use those components. So they took off-the-shelf components, sort of cut and paste them, so to speak, applied a quality control standard, and they had this product faster, better, cheaper. It did very well in India. They had an equivalent product in China, and now they have FDA approval, and they're selling in the West. Siemens also has a very large R&D center in Bangalore, and they too have been doing similar things. So for instance, in the West, we use ultrasound to check the status of the fetal heart. That's very expensive. It requires a technician. Siemens have been developing microphone technology, which is much easier to use and much cheaper. And in fact, Siemens have gone on to develop a whole suite of products in the R&D center in Bangalore. They call them smart products, which stands for simple, maintenance-free, affordable, reliable, timely to market, specifically for these emerging markets in a whole host of categories, including industrial products. And initially, these were meant for emerging markets, but now they find a market globally. Nokia, in its pomp, was a master of doing this kind of affordable innovation around customer needs. In the late 90s, they noticed that people in urban slums in places like Mumbai or Sao Paulo or Accra were buying mobile phones even though they were very expensive. So they sent their marketers, their anthropologists, to go and live with people in the slums to observe what was happening. And they noticed that people were, of course it was a prized possession, it was quite expensive for them. So to protect the mobile phone, they would wrap it in plastic to protect it from dust and grime. And then they noticed that people often didn't have electricity, so they would use this sort of rather weak light in the phone to see their way in the dark. So they took those insights back and they came up with this device, an affordable, robust mobile phone that also had a dustproof keypad and importantly, a built-in flashlight, which was a killer app. And at one point, this was the world's best-selling consumer electronics device until the iPod came along. Very successful. And in fact, now the world is awash in mobile phones. I read recently there are more mobile phones in the world than toothbrushes, which is probably alarming. If you're a dentist, it's alarming. But if you're trying to reach people who are outside the formal economy trying to get in, mobile phones help you to achieve that. So for instance, we've been talking about financial services. A large number of people around the world, possibly half the world's population, are outside the banking system trying to get in. Now, how do you do that? You can expect banks. Maybe banks will do that. They'll set up bank branches in villages and so on, but that's quite expensive and you have the last mile problem. You know, the demand isn't sufficient to justify the cost. So in Kenya, not a bank, but a mobile phone company, Vodafone subsidiary Safaricom, came up with this service, M-Pesa. Anyone familiar with it? Used it? You set it up. And partly by DFID as well. So fascinating example there of public-private. So introduced in 2007, which allow people like this lady from a village in Kenya to use her basic text-enabled Nokia phone, not only to call her son who's working in the city and earning an income, but also to ask him to send money home, which he can do using his mobile phone by texting it to her, literally. She receives it on her phone and then cashes it in the local corner shop, which is an M-Pesa agent. So you see, some of the examples of these kinds of things happening. This has taken off in a big way, not only in Kenya, but in many other countries, including countries like Afghanistan and Bangladesh and so on. It's a way to do financial inclusion very frugally. In Kenya, there are about 25 million people now on this platform, many of whom don't have bank accounts. But now that you have so many people on that network, you can sell other things to them including solar lighting solutions. So the problem that Harish Hande had in India of 300 rupees a month is too much, 10 rupees a day is not, is solved in Kenya because people have M-Pesa. So M-Kopa, for instance, will sell this kit to you, then install it in your hut in a village, and you won't have the liquidity or the bank account to take a loan and so forth. You can't pay the upfront cost. So you pay that off in micro payments, in installments, using M-Pesa every week. And it makes it easier for you as a customer, but it also makes it easy for the company, because now they don't have to send somebody to your village to chase you every week for the payment. They can remotely monitor it, and if you don't make the payment, they can cut off the supply remotely until you make the payment. Now, that book came out in 2012, and it was all about the emerging world, where a lot of growth is going to come from, and some of the challenges in the emerging world, and what Western companies going there can learn from their counterparts in those economies. But after the book came out, we realized, my co-author and I, that there was a lot of interest in frugal innovation in the West for the West. So we started to look at that. And this was partly, I think, because of the financial crisis, which put pressures on household budgets and government budgets and inequality we were talking about earlier. But I think there were also some positive drivers. So for instance, we noticed there was the rise of what we call prosumers, a minority, but a significant minority that's growing, of consumers who are no longer passive recipients of products and services from companies, but are more actively involved in the economic process. Now, these prosumers, we think, are driving at least two movements, the sharing economy and the maker movement, that somehow form the pillars of a frugal economy in the West. So the sharing economy, this is where people like you and me can directly trade spare assets with each other now on some kind of a typically digital platform. And these sharing economy businesses now have a relatively small part of the traditional rental sector, but their share is expected to grow exponentially over the next few years. How will it grow so quickly, so dramatically? Well, one reason is because these business models are fundamentally frugal. They're fundamentally asset light, as exemplified by this quote by Brian Chesky, CEO of Airbnb. So he says, we compete with Marriott. Marriott might add 30,000 rooms of capacity in this year. They'll have to do that physically. They'll have to take loans. They will have to employ people. They will have to build this infrastructure. It takes time and resources. We can add that capacity in 2 weeks because it's already there, and people merely have to click on the link and add it to their platform. And this is why these businesses grow so dramatically. This is another example of such a business. This is BlaBlaCar. Anyone familiar with BlaBlaCar? It allows you, when you're commuting, so let's say from Brussels to Antwerp, you're commuting, and you have 3 spare seats, you can sell those seats on their platform to someone else who wants to make the journey. And again, exponential growth. It now transports more people in Western Europe than Eurostar does. So this is the power of the sharing economy. But I think an even more powerful movement is the maker movement. This is where now small teams, sometimes of our students here in Cambridge, are empowered to do things that only large companies or the government could do 10 or 15 years ago. An example of this is a group of students from Northwestern University in Chicago. 2 of them had an engineering background, 1 had a business background, 1 was a designer. When they graduated, they set up this organization called Design for America, where they said, if you want to solve big problems in the world, you don't need to go to Africa or Asia. There are plenty in the US, including this problem of hospital-acquired infections, which kills something like 100,000 people every year. So they said, what can we do about it? They went to their local hospital in Chicago. They talked to doctors and nurses. They observed very quickly that doctors and nurses have every intention of being hygienic, but there are many moments in the day when they cannot go to the wall unit to dispense the gel. So they went back to their studio, which is probably a fraction of the size of this room, where they have computing equipment, software, and a 3D printer. And they brainstormed. And they said, what would a kid do? The kid would probably just run his hands on his trousers. So what if we could take that wall unit and have it clip onto the doctors and nurses' scrubs so that they could dispense the gel on the fly? So that was the insight. And then in the studio, they came up with the device, SwipeSense. That's the device that clips on. There is a digital component, a data component. So every time you dispense the gel, it sends a signal to the wall unit that records the data. And at the end of the day, the doctor or the nurse can upload it to a computer and can see how they've performed, including relative to others in the hospital. So you can set up a kind of gamification there. Now, they then decided to commercialize it, but they didn't have any money. So they crowdfunded the money they needed. Then they needed to manufacture these things, and they didn't have a factory. So they just outsourced the manufacturing. Then they needed a sales force. They didn't have a sales force. So they just listed it on Amazon. They didn't have an advertising budget. They used social media. One of them did a TED Talk that went viral. So all the things that they needed to do, from getting the idea, developing it, and then commercializing, they used things that are now ubiquitous and available to many of us. Now, I'm particularly proud of this example because this is a Cambridge example, and this is one of our former students, Eben Upton, who's behind it. Eben was, when he was doing his EMBA here, and the judge was also the computer science department responsible for student admissions. And he and his colleagues had noticed that fewer and fewer people, young people, were applying to study computer science in the UK and in Cambridge. And the ones who were applying had never opened up a computer and tinkered with the hardware, and many of them had never done any coding. So they said, what can we do about this? What if we created a computer that was so basic, you would have to tinker with it, and you would have to code for it, and it would be so cheap that if you broke it, it wouldn't be a big deal. So they came up with this basic computer, and they thought they'd sell about a few thousand units. They've now sold several million. And they've sold them not only to the kids, but often to the kids' parents, particularly the dads, who are using these frugal computers to make other frugal devices, often Internet of Things. For instance, there's a guy near Cambridge who sends these Raspberry Pis up in a hot air balloon with webcams and sensors, and he's doing do-it-yourself weather reporting. So these are the possibilities that are opening up now. A former student of mine from Imperial, he took the Raspberry Pi, he gave it a cladding, and he branded it, and then he loaded it with something called the Khan Academy. Anyone heard of the Khan Academy? Yep. It's the entire US school curriculum available in video form on YouTube for free for anyone who has access to the internet. But he said, well, there are a lot of people around the world who don't have access to the internet. They may not have access to PCs, but they often have access to TVs. So they could connect something like this to a TV, and they have access to the Khan Academy. So that's his insight. Now, we carry around these very sophisticated computers in our pockets, and they're all networked. This company, Cellscope, spun out of UC Berkeley, has developed a whole suite of medical devices like this otoscope that click into the audio jack, leverage the computing power and connectivity of the smartphone. So here's a mother using the otoscope to see, to take high-resolution pictures of the inner ear of her daughter if she has an infection, and then send them to a consultant who's somewhere else. This device is a fraction of the cost of the standalone medical device. Secondly, it enables telemedicine. And thirdly, it involves the patient in their own healthcare. This is, anyone know? 3D printer. How much do you think it costs? Yeah, it's less than $200. So at that price, it's within striking distance of households. But even if you cannot afford a 3D printer, you can go to spaces. They're called tech shops or fab labs or make spaces. There's a make space right in the heart of Cambridge. For a monthly fee, you get access to a space with all these tools, traditional tools like lathes and so on, but also digital tools, Industry 4.0 tools, like 3D printers, laser cutters, circuit board printers, and so on. But most importantly, you get access to a community of like-minded tinkerers and makers, and you can bounce your ideas off them. So you may remember these students from Stanford. For that course, they had to come up with a working prototype. So they went to the tech shop in Palo Alto, and they had this idea of a blanket that the mother could swaddle the baby in. But they knew that's not enough. You needed to have something that would keep temperature fixed, and they didn't know how to do that. At the tech shop, they ended up talking to someone who turned out to be a former NASA scientist. And he told them about phase change materials, these waxy substances that, through electricity or water, hot water, you can heat, and then it'll keep temperature constant. And that's a crucial component of their device. So that's Jane Chen from Embrace, with someone who used to live in the White House. And those are the days. When he was in the White House, he he promoted this maker movement by hosting a maker fair. And it's very interesting what he says there. Today's do-it-yourself is tomorrow's made in America. And I think there's the idea there of many cities that have where manufacturing has been hollowed out by globalization. How can you revitalize them? Perhaps by bringing back a new kind of high value add manufacturing, more creative, innovative kind of manufacturing, which also involves people in communities. And indeed, maker fairs now, cities around the world, including in the emerging world, are competing with each other to host these maker fairs. And you have these huge exhibitions where even kids are involved. I went to the European chapter in Rome a couple of years ago, and over 3 days in a very big exhibition space, you had literally thousands of people come with their kids to demonstrate stuff or to see what others were doing. There was a young kid, 13 years old. Many of them were doing Internet of Things kinds of things, using Arduino computers or Raspberry Pis. There was a 13-year-old kid who developed, he was the CEO of his company. His dad was sort of relegated to the background. And he was demonstrating his smart cars that he had designed, little ones, using all these tools. And you had students who had smart lighting solutions, all kinds of things going on. Fascinating. Now, I've talked about this kind of grassroots entrepreneurial revolution we're seeing, this led by some of our students, for instance, which is challenging the big companies and their way of doing innovation. So that the next question is, what does this mean for large companies, like you were saying, companies like GE and so on, that were used to doing innovation in a certain way, which is structured, slow, expensive, and now they need to catch up. So what does it mean for them? So we wrote a follow-up book where we focused on that question. We looked at what does this mean for large companies in the West, for the West? And essentially we said, well, this is what frugal innovation is all about. Actually, this is what all innovation should be about, maximizing value while reducing the resources needed to do that. And the value could be for customers, shareholders, or society more generally. The resources could be financial resources, natural resources, or time. And we did the same thing. We looked at lots of examples, this time of big Western companies, and we tried to extract principles we thought were driving their attempts to become more frugal. And these are the 6 principles. So engage and iterate. Engage with customers and iterate with them, very much like startups do, the whole lean startup idea. You have large companies like GE now trying to bring that into the large company to change the way they do innovation and make it more entrepreneurial. Duncan talked about flexing your digital assets, but flexing your assets more generally, your physical assets, such as your factories and your logistics and so on, but also your human assets. How can you make better use of your R&D teams? So we talk about GSK, for instance, which reorganized the way its R&D teams were structured to make them more like entrepreneurial biotechs. Create sustainable solutions. Many companies have realized that there are many economic benefits to being environmentally sustainable, reducing waste, getting things to market faster and cheaper. Many of them have made a lot of progress in doing that, but they find then that a lot of their footprint comes from the way their products are used by customers in the home. So they've realized that they have to now nudge their consumers to help them make better use of energy, water, etc. in the home. And often, again, it's Internet of Things kinds of ways of doing that, and involve data and so forth. Or co-creating value, we talked about that extensively, but particularly with these prosumers, these more proactive consumers. And of course, eventually doing it with other companies, making innovative friends. So I won't elaborate on all of those, but let me just talk about a few. So this is a French company, Tarkett, anyone know them? They make flooring solutions, including things like the carpeting here. And they have this notion that, of course, like many companies, they had a linear way of doing things. They would take resources from nature, make products, sell them to you, you'd use them, and then when you were done, you just dump them back in an unbiodegradable form. So they said, what about moving to a kind of circular model where we will reduce, reuse, and recycle all our material? So they then had this very bold, ambitious objective of being fully circular by 2020. This is the CEO who launched it. And they realized this isn't just technical. A lot of it is about their business model and how they engage with their customers. So they would have to move from just selling you something to actually giving you a service on a contractual basis over a period of time where they control the physical assets. So you may have a contract for flooring for 5 years, And they would then put in modular carpeting like this, and they would know that certain parts would wear out faster than others, and they would replace them, and then so forth. But that's quite a challenge to do that kind of thing. Paul Polman, when he took over at Unilever, launched the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan about 2010 with a very bold ambition of, by 2020, doubling the company's revenues while reducing the environmental impact by 50%. And this challenge was, in a sense, posed to everyone in the company, and they had to think about everything from logistics to how they sourced food from farmers to the packaging and so forth. Levi Strauss has done something similar with the use of water. They had a collection of jeans called Waterless, which used 96% less water, wasteless collection, and so forth. But interestingly, they realized, so what's the point if we, Levi's, use less water if our consumers then use a lot of water to wash the jeans? So they realized they had to also influence the consumer behavior, and the CEO then decided he would take the lead. So he said, you don't really need to wash your jeans that often. I haven't washed mine in a year. And this set off a whole debate. They even did all kinds of studies to look at, how much bacteria were there in jeans in certain environments. You don't really need to wash your clothes that often. Anyway, so moving on to co-creating with prosumers. Again, the way innovation was done, particularly in large companies, was very structured during the 20th century. You had something like this happen. The R&D team would work on something, they'd come up with some ideas, then they'd have the operations people sort of manufacture a product around that, and the marketing and sales people would then push it on to customers. And increasingly, we've moved away from that to do co-creation, as we were talking about. And this is what it looks like. You co-discover, particularly with prosumers, you co-design with them, and you co-market with them. And this is a much more efficient and effective way of developing products. So GE, for instance, again, is trying to do this. So they have a digital platform called First Build for home appliances. And people like you and me, particularly if you're interested in home appliances, can sign up on this platform. And then we can compete to address challenges that they pose to us. So here's an indoor grilling challenge. Design a kitchen appliance, and you could win up to 25. So you help with co-creation on a digital platform. We were talking about Ford earlier. So this is Ford, the motor company in Detroit, which has partnered with Tech Shop in Detroit to allow its R&D engineers to spend one afternoon a week in the tech shop tinkering with people from Ford and from the rest of the community. And they found that initially this improved the morale of the engineers, but it also improved their productivity. They were generating more high-value patents a year into this program. Finally, making innovative friends. We've been talking about banks like Barclays, who used to have close relationship with their customers through the bank branch, because there used to be lots of bank branches, and we used to go in and spend time in bank branches. That doesn't happen much anymore. There are not that many bank branches. We don't spend much time in them. But they know, and we know, they have all this data on us. And they have data on people like us and all the transactions that we do. So just like Amazon uses our behavioral data to give us recommendations using AI and so forth, Barclays could do the same thing. They could develop an app that would tell me, and they would personalize it. They would tell me how I want to achieve my own goals, my own savings goals, how I can do that better. Through an app where I get reminders, where I'm told, you're spending too much on Starbucks, maybe if you cut that back a bit, you could save a bit more, things like that. Now, they could do that in-house. They could develop these apps because they have the technological capability, they have the money, they have the people. But their structures and their culture make this hard to do. Why? They're hierarchical, they're siloed, there's a compliance culture, so they're a bit risk averse. It would take them time to do this. And in a place like London, they're surrounded by fintech startups that are doing this all the time, and they're doing it faster, better, and cheaper. So they said, instead of trying to beat them, why don't we join them? So they have a very big space in Milan, an accelerator, where they have a company, Techstars, manage this accelerator for them. Techstars chooses 10 promising fintech startups to house there for a 13-week period. During this 13-week period, these startups are working on their business and their business model, and they're mentored once a week by people from the main bank. Now, this helps the startups because they learn a lot about banking, which they don't know much about, from the people, from the mentors. But the mentors also learn a great deal from the entrepreneurs. They learn about the possibilities of technology and so on. And at the end of the 13 weeks, the teams pitch to a Barclays investment team. We were talking about acquisitions. And then the the bank decides, do we want to buy this and integrate it, or do we want to pass it on to somebody else? Okay, so in conclusion, large firms, frugal innovation poses a significant challenge to large firms that did innovation in a particular way. They need to learn to do more with less. There are pressures on budgets. They need to be more agile. They need to do things faster. And they need to include others in this process. Co-creation means going outside your comfortable limits. Now, 3 ways they could do this. They could give employees time and space to experiment, like Ford is doing with Tech Shop in Detroit. They could engage with agile entrepreneurs, like Barclays is doing in London. Or they could create this emerging market mindset by going there and learning how to do it, do these things faster, better, cheaper, like GE and Siemens are doing in emerging markets. Now, what if you were a small organization? If you're a small organization, you have the opposite problem in a way. You don't have the luxury of resources, so you have to be frugal. You don't have the legacy systems, so you can be agile. But then you often hit a wall when you're trying to scale because you don't have the resources to really scale your idea. And this is where you could fruitfully form a partnership with a large organization. But then you have to know how to do that, and you have to know how to work with a large organization. That's not necessarily easy. So I'll just end by saying that, based on my work over the last 10 years or so, I really believe the world needs this kind of frugal, flexible, and inclusive innovation. I think firms from developed economies can benefit by engaging with emerging economies and vice versa. And I think large and small firms can work together to improve lives everywhere. Thank you.